It's really terrific to be able to welcome everybody to this event. This is the 4th annual symposium on hybrid scholarship at Yale University. We call this event Beyond Boundaries. This is the 4th year in a row that this event has been organized as part of the program of the Digital Humanities Laboratory here at Yale University Library, and the 4th year that it's been organized almost single-handedly by Catherine DeRose, whom I hope most of you in the room have heard of, if not met. Kathy is in a new role here in the Digital Humanities Laboratory, serving as the manager for the Digital Humanities Lab. And it's really due to her organization and her vision that we've been able to do these 4th year in a row of the Beyond Boundaries Symposium. And really the move to this part of the library, because as those of you who've attended before know that we've been in the lecture hall, the move to this part of the library and the connection with the Franke Family Digital Humanities Lab to my right is symbolic of a bigger renovation, a bigger shift in the library physically, and a really exciting suite of new services that we're offering in the Franke Room to support digital scholarship, hybrid scholarship, and the digital humanities in a beautiful new room through the generosity of the Franke family in conjunction with the Goizueta Foundation. We're going to be holding our poster session at the end of today's activities in the Franke Room, which I hope those of you in the room have seen this before, but if you haven't, it's a really terrific opportunity to see the breadth and depth of projects that we're highlighting in the Franke Room right after our roundtable discussion today. As I mentioned, this is the 4th year we've held Beyond Boundaries, and we're doing it in partnership not only with Yale STEAM, which is a group that is dedicated to the intersection of STEM and the arts and humanities, but also this year in a new effort with Code for Good, which is a group on campus that is interested in the social impact of code and programming. We're really excited to be able to partner with these two student-focused organizations to bring you Beyond Boundaries. We're going to just go right into our lightning talks. I think we have 7 folks who are going to be able to give us some terrific insight into things they've been working on. These include efforts by undergraduates and graduate students. And so without further ado, I'd like to ask Zen to come up and to talk to us about organizing without oppression, building democracies in the 21st century. Zen?
Good afternoon. It's an honor to be here today. My name is Zen Tang, and I'm a senior in the Stats and Data Science department. So I'd like to start by asking a question. How many of you guys have heard of the Singularity? I see a lot of hands going up. And you might think of it as a point where machine intelligence and artificial intelligence kind of rapidly improves and maybe surpasses human intelligence. You might think of it as a synthesis of perhaps human and machine, where we work in integrative systems. You might think of it as a robot apocalypse, where the machine just becomes really good at making paper clips. And something that I think scares at least me, and I'm sure maybe some of you, is that there's this question of how do we make sure that the systems we build actually do what we really want them to? Not what we say we want them to, but what we really mean. How can machines made out of silicon and programming languages ever comprehend what it means to feel, what we value in life, how we live and act, and how we conduct ourselves with our fellow humans? I think one problem here is the issue of trust. Part of these issues are, do we have faith that the machine that we build will in fact satisfy these specifications? As computer scientists, we might like to have some kind of guarantee. We might want to say, okay, here are certain criteria that our systems will satisfy. We might want to prove that, for example, these systems can't go havoc. They can't, for example, turn into a totalitarian regime. Now, some of the questions involved here might seem pretty new. For example, autonomous car systems have been around only for a couple of times. But as a matter of fact, these questions are actually really old. They've been some of the questions that we've been thinking about for hundreds, if not thousands of years. we've actually had super intelligences for almost as long as we've had civilization. Now, what do these super intelligent systems look like? I mean, I don't see any AI here. They look like governments, systems of law, maybe economies. These organizations of people and machines can do things that none of us ever could. They integrate terabytes, if not exabytes, of information every day, shape the flow of information and resources across the whole world, and sometimes do things that we wouldn't really want or expect from our systems, things like war, famine, and other things. Now, the people who ask these kinds of questions, I'm actually sorry for the yellow. That might be hard to read. So the people who ask these kinds of questions are generally regarded perhaps as political theorists, economists, philosophers, artists, and writers. These questions are, do these systems actually act for my best interest? Do they act in the best interest of society? And if we're in charge of designing these systems as a society, how do we design them so that they have the properties that we want? How do we design them so that they ensure, for example, freedom and equality for everyone? How do we design these systems so that there are safeguards in place so that if these systems ever do fail, we have some assurance that they won't fail terribly? Things that the founding fathers were doing when they founded America, when they wrote down the Constitution. Things that people do when they talk about checks and balances. Things like taxation or social goods. Now, as part of this talk, I would like to share with you a vision for our democracy and how this would apply to us today. A lot of democratic theorists think that democracy in its current form is not fixed. Democracy is, in fact, malleable. It's subject to change. And in a lot of different systems, it might not even look like what we think of democracy as we think of it today. For example, how many of you think that voting is absolutely essential to democracy? How many of you think that deliberation is absolutely essential? Could we have one without the other? Possibly not. Is one more important than the other? Could we have different forms of voting? And these are questions that a lot of people have explored in recent years, but also in years past. And this kind of comes at a time when democracy is kind of hit by seemingly recent forces. For example, the rise of fake news, political non-participation. And these criticisms of democracy are something that we have to think about, both in terms of, as citizens, what they mean to us, but also in terms of system designers. How do we design new systems so that these issues can be perhaps mitigated? I'd like to share with you a few ideas that a lot of really cool people have had. For example, one of the professors in the political science department here, Helen Landemore, has proposed an idea of open democracy, which is kind of taking from the Habermasian point of view, where you have systems of deliberative discourse that are kind of centered around exchanging ideas between people. So for example, you might elect a randomly selected body of citizens, and those citizens could deliberate in the best interest of all citizens. And if they were a random sample, perhaps they would kind of encapsulate the kinds of interests that people in general have. You might also think about, for example, systems like liquid democracy, where you would give your vote, perhaps, to someone that you trust. So instead of everyone voting for a state representative, voting for president, you would just give your vote to someone. And they could vote on your behalf on certain issues. You may also think about ideas about context and what kind of forums we might need for democracy. For example, would Facebook be a good forum to discuss certain issues? I'm sure we found that like Facebook has a lot of interesting things with it. And so with technology comes a certain responsibility, but also a certain opportunity. So I'd like to share with you some ideas for bringing these kinds of theories into practice and giving us a sense of where do we go from here and how do humans and technology kind of interact to form government systems. So a lot of experiments on democracy have been smaller scale. They've revolved around citizen participation, very specific issues. And a lot of the processes of government that we have today are actually really effective at what they do. For example, think of the city of New Haven or the United States. We have to kind of balance a lot of different issues. So one proposal is to test new ideas of democracy by having a virtual online platform. And this platform would actually kind of abstract over core fundamental entities like people and votes and give you a set of primitives on which to build new democracies. So one experiment that I've kind of been working on is kind of gathering a set of people to kind of build the first version of this democratic infrastructure, in which you would have a layer that forms a foundation for building new kinds of assemblies, different forms of referenda, different forms of voting, and making that available to researchers, to people in the communities, to kind of figure out where that kind of technology would fit and how it would work in our existing government. So our idea is to focus on smaller scale municipal governments, just because it's easier to work with people in a local context. And towns are also kind of like big enough so that you could have interesting democratic experiments. And it's kind of the starting phases of this research, but we're kind of thinking about kind of expanding it to more people, getting more people involved in thinking about some of these issues, like what kind of values should we kind of think about as we build out these systems. And yeah, do we have any questions?
Well, that's actually, I want to thank Zen for being our first speaker, and we're actually going to hold questions for the poster session in the next room, because I know that folks are going to have all sorts of interesting interactions with our speakers. But thank you so much for going first.
Thank you so much.
Well, continuing the theme of other ways of organization, we have a talk next by Francis Fagan on Utilitarian Utopias, public libraries as key policy partners for integration and skills training programs. Let's see if I can find you.
I don't know how to use this, so.
No problem.
Do I just?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you all for coming. Thank you. I would especially like to thank the Franke Family Digital Humanities Lab staff for their ongoing support and guidance in our research. I feel like the field of digital humanities is particularly important today. We're experiencing what has been called a fourth industrial revolution, which is marked by dramatic transformation in both the technologies that impact our working lives and the ethnographic changes that are reshaping our communities. And the visualization tools that digital humanities provides allow us to assess and share these changes with others, as we will see in the conversations today and the posters that will be presented later. So I'm Frances Fagan. I'm a political science student here at Yale University, and my interests lie in social integration and labor policy, particularly how programs related to social integration and skills training are coordinated and implemented at the local and municipal level. And it's convenient that we are in a library today because I am fascinated by these institutions. So here, this image allows us to see all of Connecticut's public libraries. And because of their branch systems, public libraries frequently have built-in network characteristics which allow for coordinated programming and the sharing of best practices. So bringing us into New Haven, this compact image taken from the New Haven Free Public Library's website shows us that there are 5 public libraries in the city and a bookmobile. It also allows us to look at user trends for the library and their services in 2018. And I'm not sure what your perceptions of public libraries are, but they have been drastically changing. So they're adapting their services in programming to meet the very demands posed by changes in social demographics and labor needs. The books are still popular, as we can see in this infographic. There's a constant and steady increase in Wi-Fi usage and program attendance. And these programs range from story times for new parents, to coding courses for children, to resume workshops and more. And these trends and programs are consistent across developed nations as well. And I can share my research from France, the UK. Ask me questions about libraries, please. And here we see a selection of digital courses offered for free on a monthly basis right down the street at Ives Public Library. A key service offered by public libraries is digital literacy, defined by the American Library Association as a skill that, quote, enables the individual to recognize when information is needed and gives them the ability to locate, evaluate, and use that information more effectively, end quote. It's not enough to simply have access to a smartphone or a computer. In order to stay in a truly democratic society, all members must be able to navigate increasingly complex technologies, much as we are doing in this symposium on digital humanities today, right? Examples of digital literacy here range from free classes on how to assess and analyze everyday information, like the infographics and these PowerPoints, to establishing professional networks through LinkedIn. This variety of free training is impressive, yet if we look at the relationship between government agencies and public library networks, we see a lack of coordination. This is Connecticut's 211, which is a state site that is intended to serve as a one-stop portal linking users to essential services throughout the state. Yet when I entered job training formats in New Haven, only one option came up. And as we can see, it's a pre-employment background check site. Related searches linked to agencies which often had barriers to entry, including age, income, and veteran status. The lack of coordination between government agencies working with integration and labor policy and relevant public library programming is not unique to the United States. Although both the European Commission and the OECD stress the urgent need to provide basic educational programming and digital literacy training throughout their member states, their policy prescriptions rarely, if ever, mention public library networks as potential partners. And if there are any librarians in the room, you know how extensive these networks are. All right, so in addition to these more targeted digital literacy programming, there are countless opportunities to engage in diverse social and cultural events in public libraries. Such encounters can strengthen community relationships in what can be politically and economically fraught times. Here we see examples of some of these programs at libraries in New Haven, as well as an image of the newly remodeled Ives Squared space, where among other cool events, entrepreneurs can get advice on their startups from external partners and residential fellows. Earlier today, in fact, there was a meetup of game developers where participants from all ages and skill levels came together to share advice and get support. I would definitely recommend, if you hadn't been to Ives Square or been into the New Haven Public Library since they renovated, to go and check it out. So I'll conclude by pulling back to this overview of public library networks at the state level, and I'll ask that we reconsider not only the density of these institutions, but also the reach of their extended networks of patrons, government agencies, and external partnerships. How might these connections better serve the needs of contemporary societies? And perhaps more importantly, what is your public library up to right now? Thank you so much. I look forward to learning about digital humanities research with you and to answering any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Thanks so much to Francis for that. And I'd like to call up for our next speaker, Keniel Liao, who's going to speak about virtual politics, a case study of Reddit.
Great, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be with you guys today. I'm really excited about the work that Beyond Boundaries does. Specifically in my own interest as a statistics student whose first love, intellectual love, really was anthropology. I think there are increasing worlds of social research which necessitate and demand a data science approach. And today's research that I'll be presenting from my senior thesis lends itself to that as well. The idea I see data science and its intersection with anthropology is this, specifically that when we're looking at online lives, how do we listen to data? Well, specifically with statistics. And it suits political life online, especially with platforms like Reddit, specifically because users are anonymous and they're ageographical. And so those are approaches and words that aren't often associated with ethnographic research where you're necessarily part of a community in a space with people who have names. And so statistics seems to be a much more natural, lends itself more naturally to this. Great. The research I'll be presenting on today is really focusing on this question, what does a like mean? And what is a good political comment? And so this research focuses on the politics subreddit, which is a sub-community within Reddit focused on US politics. And it analyzes data from 2008 to 2018. Just for a sense of scale on this data, there's about like a terabyte worth across, which is all stored. Every single post and comment on Reddit is stored online on Google Cloud and is extremely accessible. Cool. Let's see. So it's interesting because I feel like a lot of social research focuses on Facebook and Twitter. And these don't seem to lend themselves as easily to statistical research because there's a lot of privacy concerns. Whereas Reddit is inherently a public website. It's known as the front page of the internet. And surprisingly, for a lot of people, I don't think they know that, this was actually the third most clicked upon website in 2018. Just after Google and after Facebook. After Google and after YouTube, so before Twitter and Facebook. Additionally, in terms of engagement, based on its population of users, there are more clicks on Reddit per user than any other site. So in terms of the richness of engagement and the richness of data, Reddit really seems to be a promising tool. But there's something special about the politics sub-community on Reddit. Specifically, that with Reddit, each subreddit has its own set of rules. And so here, the unique thing about politics is that users are only allowed to post news articles. Specifically, in their posts, the headline must be identical to the news article website, and the content must be a link to the news article, which means that users can't impose anything else. And interpretation and political commentary can only occur in the comments. It's really interesting to look at the distribution of some of the articles here. I apologize for the lack of labeling on the y-axis, but what that means is I use a topic model to assess all of the news headlines that have been posted on Reddit from 2008 to 2018, and group them using topic modeling and then using a walk trap clustering algorithm into 6 main themes. So the first one reflects foreign policy. It's really interesting that it's kind of stagnant until after 2016. What actually happens is that Trump gets associated with a lot of foreign policy because of the Mueller investigation and because of Russia. And so those topics actually changed their meaning after 2016. The graph number 2 indicates popular issues, which remains relatively static across all time. The increase just is an increase in population of Reddit. Let's see, number 3 is election issues, which of course rise up in 2012 and 2016, but particularly after 2016. The bump in 2016 with number 4 actually indicates campaign corruption, which shows it bubbles up in 2016 and then dies down again. And number 5 talks about economic policy, which is pretty stagnant overall. So there's really cool topic modeling things that you can do with the whole subreddit, and a lot of really interesting topics come out as well. So you see the Keystone Pipeline becoming its own topic. You see Fire and Fury becoming its own topic. Mueller investigation becoming its own topic as well. It's a really, really clean data set. So the key question coming across. Here, a particularly interesting rule that the moderators have placed, but they can't enforce, is that they want users on politics, to vote, basically like or dislike comments based on the quality and not the opinion of the comment. You can't enforce it just because likes are anonymous and because there's a ton of them, right? And so it's interesting to see what actually happens, which is the focus of this talk. This is an example of a post, one of the most popular posts of all time, which is Donald Trump becoming president, from AP. And the first comment says, 4 dim, faithless electors from Washington, 3 pal, 1 spotted eagle. What's interesting about Reddit, again, is that there is no personalization of feeds. You can subscribe to different communities, but within a community, everyone sees exactly the same thing in the same order, both post-wise and comment-wise. And these are related, this order is determined by the popularity, which is the likes and the downvotes of each comment. And so here we can, if you're interested, you can transfer every single post into a tree-like structure, where because you can have comments, comments to comments, etc., you can build out kind of what long comment chains are and how users are interrelated. But here's the experiment. If we're thinking about what makes a comment successful or what makes people like a certain comment, I framed it in terms of this hypothesis. Running a classifier to see whether a model using just generic variables, so for example, how popular the post was, where it came from, the news article, and when it was posted. Comparing that with specific language features, which one is more predictive? The idea is that if language features can actually help prediction, we can also detect which language features actually lead to a comment being associated with a higher score or lower score. And so I run this with logistic regression. Basically, what that happens is it's classifying comments into either popular comments or unpopular or not popular comments, where popular comments is defined as ones who make the top three most liked comments of all time on that post. Just, if you're interested, the language features come from a program called LIWC, or Linguistic Inquiry and Word Count, which is a state-of-the-art psychometric language analysis tool. And it labels comments or any sort of text with positive and negative emotions, but also things like how analytical it is, how much power is used, authenticity, emotional tone. And so these are a lot of interesting and richer variables coming from the psychological literature that we can easily label our text with. I analyzed my data on 2012, 2016, and 2018 data, but just here are some of the brief results. You'd expect 50% to be like just a random prediction of whether a comment is successful or not. And we achieve about 70% accuracy with both the baseline and with the language feature model. There's no significant difference between the baseline and the language feature model. Precision and recall, what that means, precision is if I label a comment as being in the top 3, how many of them are truly in the top 3? And we get about 2/3 accuracy on that. And recall is, of all of the top 3 comments, how many do I actually pick up as correct? And I get about an 80% accuracy on that. And so it performs much better than chance, but there's a few more parameters that we can tweak that I'll do later on that are interesting. In terms of predictive models, here are some of the language features that the model picks up on. And so we see that comments which are analytical and emotional both tend to lend themselves towards high popularity. The contrast there is interesting. But then we can also look at more sophisticated words with longer words, words in dictionaries, and things using numbers are also more predictive of a comment being successful. And interestingly, using more generic adjectives and using informal speech associates itself with not being successful. Just for those of you who are interested in topic modeling, this is the next kind of step in the process, which is if we've associated each post and article with a theme or a topic, then after that we can really go and see how language features vary with each topic. So for example, are posts which have to do with economics more favorable if they're more quantitative? Whereas if it's more about like political scandals, do they lend themselves towards more emotion? And so that's possible with the mixed effects model that I'm going to explore later on. But yeah, thank you for listening to the talk.
Thanks so much to Keniel for that. And I'd like to invite up Tyler Lutz, who's going to be speaking to us on science in fiction, modern physics as mirror and muse.
All right, thank you. In Conjectures on World Literature, Franco Moretti articulates a conception of literature as the composite product of endogenous phylogenetic literary developments of a given language or tradition, and waves of exogenous foreign forms that continually buffet and modulate them. To read world literature, in Moretti's account, is to read with a sufficient distance from the text that these global waves, developments like the novel or stream of consciousness, come into focus. Preempting the criticism that any such world literary critical project might undermine the coherence of national literatures, Moretti owns that, quote, there is no other justification for the study of world literature but this, to be a thorn in the side, a permanent intellectual challenge to national literatures. My project takes as its originary motive the question, what is world literature's thorn in the side? Or to put it in other words, why stop at planetary boundaries? The dizzying expanses of intergalactic space, the humming nonsense propounded at inscrutably small scales, and the coordinated chaos of global climactic formations are all as much sites of cultural production as any national literature, all domains of human experience that we each partake in. Where do they fit in Moretti's tidy scheme of interconnected ethno-linguistic polities? Hoyt Long and Richard Janso's restylization of Moretti's global waves as turbulent flow takes a crucial step towards highlighting that the very figure undergirding Moretti's world literature is itself a borrowed, foreign form. These are mesoscale eddies in the ocean compiled by NASA. It's only through the combined cultural production of interwoven networks, not only of economic historians that Moretti highlights, but also cartographers, archaeologists, astronauts, and planetary scientists of all stripes, that we can even begin to visualize the patterns of global circulation that are a precondition for world literature. And not only are world and national literatures but two nodes in a vast assemblage of interlinked intellectual projects, it also becomes difficult to ascribe any kind of hierarchy to them. The closer we look even at ostensibly hyper-local forms, let's zoom in on one of these waves, the more we realize that the local materials that Moretti is imagining are themselves subject to cycles of global circulation. This is an artwork by Chris Jordan made up of 2.4 million pieces of plastic. That's equivalent to the amount of plastic that we put in the ocean every hour. You could argue this is a bit of a contrived example. But let me remind you that the very English language that I'm using right now is nothing more than the accreted flotsam of many different languages. So I want to take this very seriously as a model for literature itself. And if you'll squint at it just a little bit, we can actually see something that looks a lot like literature. This is, to borrow from Keniel's topic modeling, this is a topic model of a corpus of fictional texts taken from Hathi Trust. This represents 1920 to 1922. And what we're seeing here, every bubble represents a cluster of words. They're grouped here according to the likelihood of their co-occurrence in different texts within the corpus. And we can see some kind of recognizable features here. Here, one of these topics looks like a kind of courtly fiction. Upon, king, thou, shall. This might be something more like a Western. Camps, trails, or some rivers, some Indians. And here's a gendered domestic space. It's not entirely obvious what these topics are supposed to represent, though. Can we call them genres? Are they somehow micro-discourses, little subsets of the language? What I want to argue is that what this topic model is showing us, actually, is literature resolved very literally into its constitutive hermeneutic circles, domains in which form and material are mutually co-determining. In other words, the closer we look at world literature, the closer we find that we end up right back where we started, at these turbulent eddies. I'm thinking of world literature as a kind of fractal pattern. There's a subset of these eddies that I'm actually somewhat qualified to talk about as a physicist. Words like this, entropy. As a word, entropy was invented in 1980 by Clausius in Germany. I'm playing with two different spellings here to account for the difference in the languages. It gets reinvented in 1950 by Shannon in an information theoretic context. And ever since then, it's kind of been percolating into these different national literatures. But true to my argument, I want to think of entropy as more than just a word. Through the magic of the second law of thermodynamics, it contains within it an entire narrative in miniature. It goes like this: stuff breaks. We could even think of entropy as designating a kind of micro-genre. What I hope to do with my work is to contribute a small amount to the project that we might as well call cosmic literature, by investigating how physics, as a collection of words and stories that are continually folding back into each other, how that physics both informs and is shaped by the material constituents and formal determinants of literature. One place to start is to disaggregate I'm going to take the English literatures in the bottom two rows here and disaggregate them by genre. Here's a time series of how entropy shows up in my corpus. This is not something I would have expected. Apparently poets are a lot more interested in entropy than are dramatists and fiction writers. If we poke around a bit more, we can find other words that show a similar shape. Here's centrifugal. Centripetal also has a similar shape. So does disorder. And we can go on and on like this. Chaos seems to be something that poetry is very interested in. I want to argue that's a mistake, though. I neither want to say that poetry is somehow an inherently chaotic, disordered, dizzy medium, nor do I want to say that physics has somehow been pushing it in that direction. My working hypothesis is that both poetic and natural scientific depictions of things like disorder and chaos form a closed loop, each ramifying each other through a diversity of different channels. And just so you don't go away thinking poetry is the only one getting in the action here, here's a similar shape, different word, but now actually drama seems a lot more interested in quantum than either poetry or fiction. Likewise with galaxy. I don't know what to say about these things. I don't know how to interpret them. What I do as a scientist, I want to cast a certain amount of shade on them. These are averages. Of course, averages we know are affected by extreme events. What we really want to do is take a time slice in these and ask ourselves, for every point on here, what is the distribution of texts, the average of which is shown here? So here I've done that for you. I'm looking at a different word now. This is temperature in fiction in the same time period. The x-axis here is plotting the normalized word occurrence in a text, the word frequency, and the y-axis is showing how many texts talk about temperature at that frequency. This is a log-log plot, and it looks quite a lot like a power law. That's super cool. Again, I don't know what this means. I also know it's not tremendously surprising. Power laws show up all over computational linguistics. But it's useful for something. By measuring the slope of this line, we get the exponent in the power law. In other words, we get, in a certain sense, how quickly interest in these words falls off as a function of the corpus. And we can do this for different words as well. Here I'm looking at the word infinite. We can try it in poetry, drama, fiction. Of course, we can do this through time. These are no longer fits now. Now my power law hypothesis is kind of falling apart. Maybe it might work for poetry. For drama, it's a bit more complicated. But that in itself is an interesting point. As a physicist, you might want to call this something like a power spectrum. And it's interesting to ask, where do words enter these genres? Are they coming in, are they just percolating in through general usage? In which case, we might expect something like this, the fictional case, where they're showing up in the general language and they're sort of moving into texts in a more concentrated fashion? Or do they show up maybe already, like in the drama case here, do they just pop in as concentrated bursts that then flatten out as time goes on? So that's just a snapshot of some of the questions that I'm interested in. I thank you for your attention. I'm very eager to hear your thoughts.
Thanks so much to Tyler. And could now invite Elisa up to speak about lived experience as a theory of innovation.
Hi everyone, I'm Lisa, a junior studying economics, and I'm also in the human rights program. And this year I've been working at SciCity as part of the knowledge equity team to study some questions that I want to present to you here all today. So to start off with, this is IKEA's refugee shelter. And it was designed at the height of the refugee crisis, bringing together IKEA's approach of easy construction and easy assembly to the massive need for housing for the millions of refugees coming from the Syrian civil war and other global conflicts. So naturally, this shelter won numerous awards. It was praised for being easy to assemble with no tools necessary, for being more durable, for being stab-proof, and more. Yet when the refugee shelter was actually deployed, it became quickly apparent that it was not all that it was chalked up to be. So some of the complaints about the shelter: meager, limited, lack of use of local materials, no insulation, lack of natural light. How can it be that a shelter that won so many awards for changing people's lives actually had all these issues? And I'm sure that the designers did their research, but it's clear to me that a true understanding of the whole spectrum of local needs was not at the center of this design. So why then would this refugee shelter receive so many awards when a refugee shelter like this one, crafted ingeniously out of scavenged materials by refugees themselves, is not applauded as similarly innovative? Why is it that innovation that derives from lived experience, from actually being a refugee, is not receiving awards? Why is it that learned expertise has a monopoly, that learned expertise is the only expertise, and that professionals are the only experts? Naturally, this is hardly limited to the international development space. I think too often, especially in the social sector, those in power do not have lived experience with the issues at hand. And so I want to study why is that. And this semester, as part of the Knowledge Equity Initiative at Sci-City, I've been studying some of the philosophy behind AI to see what it can reveal about the nature of knowledge. And specifically, I've used AI as a foil to study how human brains value lived experience. So first, AI naturally is intelligence exhibited by a computer as opposed to a human or a living being. And obviously, AI does not have to be oriented around human intelligence or replicating human intelligence, but that's the approach I'm taking. So fundamentally, there are two components of AI, data and algorithms. We can think of data as a noun and algorithms as a verb. Data represents characteristics within our world, from personal data, which are markers of our lives, to group data, to machine-based data. Algorithms are the mechanisms by which these characteristics are transformed into something useful. And more often than not, that something useful is a decision, but it can also be patterns that help make decisions and heuristics as well. For us as humans, we might think of algorithms within our brains as wisdom or knowledge. One of the biggest debates in artificial intelligence is algorithms versus data. Which is more important for AI? Well, we might see better algorithms as better reasoning skills and better critical thinking skills. And for humans, the equivalent of more data might be more conversations had or more experiences. Of course, these two are intimately related. Having more conversations, for example, leads not only to a broader pool of data points on which our brains can draw upon, but also might improve our critical thinking skills. But it is also important to point out that data and algorithms are not the same thing. A lack of good data is not going to be fully compensated by a good algorithm, and a plethora of data will not compensate for a poor algorithm. So another question to think about is whether more data is always going to produce better decisions. And that's not necessarily true. More data can add noise. But what is true, and I'm quoting the Quora data science team head here, is that better data is always better. So data that is related to the issue that we're studying. So given this framework, where does lived experience fit in? Well, we can think of lived experience as having characteristics of both data and algorithms. It's not data represented in numbers, which is how many of us are used to thinking of data, but it's data as a record of our experiences. And lived experience as data is better data because it's related to the issues that we are studying. Lived experience is also like algorithms in that it influences the lens through which we process information. So given all of this, I think what the artificial intelligence model tells us is that if the output of our brains is the product of the inputs and reasoning skills, then the ideas we are able to generate are directly related to the experiences we've had. Thus, learned expertise will not have the same realm of possible ideas as lived expertise and vice versa. So an example to bring us back to the refugee shelters, someone who has experienced the insecurity of statelessness is going to have an understanding of what it means to be a refugee and what refugee needs are that is not replicated by someone who doesn't have that same lived experience. And so the creativity and innovation that lived experience generates is fundamentally different from someone who is a professional in the international development space. While a master's degree in international development might provide an algorithm with which we can think about statelessness and insecurity, that is never going to replace the lack of true understanding of what it means to be a refugee and the innovation that derives from that lived experience. What all of this is to say is that lived experience is innovation, that our realm of possibilities is fundamentally related to the experiences that we've had, and it's also not to say that it's lived experience versus learned experience, but rather that each of us has a unique combination of lived and learned experiences that influence our ideas and our creativity. We just need to be better about recognizing this fact. So then, how did our bias against learned expertise develop? Well, also based on our own experiences. For a variety of reasons, the world we live in values the professional, but this doesn't mean that lived experience is fundamentally less useful. It just means that we have socially constructed the meaning around lived experience. So finally, I want to conclude with a hopeful example of how valuing lived experience can improve our world and also see lived experience as a theory of innovation. So this is Pigeonly, a company founded to facilitate communications between inmates and their loved ones. Obviously, family connection and communication is a crucial support system for rebuilding lives after prison. And that was a crucial point recognized not by someone who's never been to prison, but by a former prisoner himself. So Frederick Hudson, an inmate, founded this company after his experience in prison, and he used that experience to found it as the root of his innovation. His understanding of how communication in prisons work, combined with his learned experience participating in an accelerator, is what allowed this idea to flourish. So in conclusion, I think this conference is all about breaking boundaries, but I also hope how we can build bridges and see how AI can help us value lived experience as a theory of innovation. Thank you.
Thanks so much to Lisa for that. And now I'd like to call up our final speaker, Mario, who will be talking to us about generative and variational choreography via machine learning. Okay, that's right. I remember that.
So this work started with a question: can I use my technical background to extend my choreographic practice and create new work that still feels like my own? Or, to quote my hero, postmodern choreographer Pina Bausch, how can I, well, she said, I didn't want to imitate anybody. Any movement I knew I didn't want to use. And so to me, that means, how do I get out of my own head and my own body while still remaining in my body and creating new work using this tool? And what I would say is this not only requires freshness and novelty, because at the extreme of freshness and novelty could be abstraction or something that isn't meaningful or is alienating to an audience. But it's also dangerous to stay within a comfort zone of something that feels authentic, because sometimes that can just be read as trite or not generalizable to an audience. So what I'm interested in is this intersection of freshness and novelty and authenticity. And in Pina Bausch's case, I think this often, this should be a video. This often creates really fascinating results in choreographies. So what I chose to embark on is this adventure to combine machine learning to generate choreography in some interesting ways. I thought that as a scientist, I might have something unique to contribute to this conversation, as well as a choreographer talking about lived experiences and how this can be useful. So this is not me alone. Although I started on my own, I quickly found out that collaboration is one of the best ways to advance your project. So I'm in the physics department here as a PhD student in particle physics. And so I've joined up with my collaborator Joyce, who's a postdoc in the physics department as well, with Doug, who is established here, as well as my colleague Ilya, who's a dancer and researcher in his own right, some VR and AR artists, and some new dancers who have been thrown into the mix. So a really interesting group of people in the room at once. My data collection started at the CCAM, the Center for Collaborative Arts and Media. This is in their new motion capture studio, and I've highlighted these motion capture cameras within the room. There are 20 in total. And so I suited up with these very reflective sensors on my body. So overall, the data set that I was analyzing was a series of about 55 points on my body in 3 full dimensions with very few gaps in the data at a pretty high frame rate for a pretty extended period of time. This is me dancing in the space. So we didn't throw machine learning at this problem arbitrarily. Machine learning has been shown to be a really effective tool for understanding very complex and nonlinear data sets. That was proven back in the 90s to show that we can use machine learning to approximate any continuous and bounded function within certain limits, with some caveats to that. But in general, we approach neural networks because they are this incredibly powerful tool for approximating very complicated functions. And, oh, this is a bummer that these videos aren't showing. Let me see if I can try this way. This is connected to Wi-Fi, right? Oof. Yeah, I don't know what to do about this, but I can illustrate and describe. But basically, I would say that something that I have also found interesting about my exploration of neural networks is that they are choreographic in themselves. The training of a neural network involves directing the movement of various elements of your neural network itself through this landscape, this higher dimensional or lower dimensional landscape that represents the error inherent in your model at any one point in time. So by directing our model in its learning, it's yes, oh great, cool. So this sort of represents this trajectory through space, represents this higher dimensional or maybe an abstract representation of my model at any one point in time. I'm trying to give it the right instructions to get to a minimum of one of these points. So you can see that this model is sort of moving towards a minimum. So I want to minimize my error overall in my model. And so this is a sense of choreography in itself of figuring out the right ways to direct this model. And so I wanted to emphasize this because I already know of choreographic research as very rigorous research in its own right. So I didn't want to approach this problem as a sense of elevating choreographic work through a lens of technology. So in a sense, I'm seeing this from the perspective as a deep dive into machine learning research with an interesting and meaningful data set, as well as perhaps enhancing my choreographic research through an extended body or an extended choreographic mind. And I want to highlight 3 areas of this research that this work has evolved into: preservation, variation, and invention. By preservation, I mean a sort of physicalized choreographic brain. And for me, that has a lot of meaning that I don't have time to get into. But I'll sketch out that, to me, movement is a part of my identity, and I don't have a strong way of preserving that for my own life. And so this idea of preserving someone's style, like for me, people have often said that something about my movement reminds them of my mom. So there's this sense of what does it mean to preserve a human when style and movement is important to your own identity. And also for myself to retain the potential to invent with my current choreographic body or maybe future iterations of my choreographic body at any point in time. So I find that very fascinating. And so this literally can represent the actual data of motion capture of myself improvising in this studio, which is compelling in its own right. But I hope to extend that by also physicalizing the potential of my body to choreograph. So not only a record, but a kind of limitless model that can constantly generate new work. Now I wanted to show what that looks like when that model is not trained very well, just to give you guys a sense that it's very difficult to capture a human body moving. It's a complicated problem. And I am not imposing any constraints into this model about what a human should look like. And so I hope that gives some context for some of the exciting results that we were able to achieve later, where we are able to generate arbitrary length sequences of movement that really do feel authentically like myself because it is derived from my own data. Now, not only are we interested in preservation, we're interested in variation. So preservation might be looking only towards future results. Variation is rather looking inward, trying to understand something deeper about what my choreography represents. And so to me, that has represented projecting this complicated dimensional data set into a reduced dimensional data set to understand some basic features about how it operates. As a dancer, this is also interesting because to me it's stripping the body away from the choreographic work and focusing in on some kind of innate idea that is not disturbed by the body in whatever imperfections it might have. And it also allows me to explore related movements to input data sets that I've already included. So this is great for a rehearsal studio, this idea of sort of riffing off of a choreographic idea many times. So this is one example of how we can look at choreography in an abstract way. This is using principal component analysis. And what this does is this plot shows a bit of my choreography over time, But of course, it doesn't look like choreography. I can peer into this model at various points. So what I've illustrated here are 2 points that are separate in time in the sequences that have been somehow grouped together by this model. And you can see that the model is capturing something that feels real or intrinsic about the choreographic idea, something about moving upwards, for example, or me crawling on all fours. So there are some ideas that are grouped in a meaningful way. Now, we also have more powerful ways of reducing the dimensionality of this data set. PCA is actually a fairly simple way of looking at data because it is linear. Now, machine learning gives us nonlinear learning capabilities. So what we ended up using was what we call an autoencoder, which can represent a lower dimensional representation of this work in a nonlinear, complicated way. Here are some examples of this abstract dimensional version of my work. This represents a variation on a reference sequence A. And so reference sequence B here is somehow found by this model to be highly related, but somehow different, and also completely generated in a sense. So I'll flash some quick examples of variation. So here, what this represents, the red person is close to real data, whereas the colorful person is a generated variation. And what's interesting about this is that it's able to maintain a similar sense of rhythm and style, and yet it somehow feels completely fresh and is giving its own kind of perspective on this idea. So in some cases, we see that it adds spins or rotations. Sometimes it removes spins and rotations, or, this is my favorite example, translates a kick into an upward movement in the arms. So there's a sense of upwardness as an idea translated into a different part of the body. And finally, invention, breaking new choreographic ground that I otherwise didn't have access to without this technology. This allows us to explore new areas of my choreographic latent space that I, as a human, have not been able to force myself to access through whatever games or choreographic constraints I want to use. So here I'm going to show some generated sequences from my choreographic latent space that the model has constructed for me. They're quite short, so I'll flash through some of them, but you can see that they look like a person, and to me it feels like me, but they're completely invented. And finally, I would say this has just been the start of some of our play and our research. There's a lot of data to be scraped also from video performances, and so I've shown an example of this on myself in a rehearsal studio. What this allows me to do is to take choreographers or dancers who I couldn't put into the Yale CCAM motion capture studio and instead look at videos of their performances and analyze their movements in that way. So I could imagine sampling from a combination of many choreographers' latent spaces at once. We're also interested in translating motion from between bodies and also analyzing duets and partner work to imagine generating a partner given an input sequence of a single mover. And so on and so on. Research doesn't have an end, so thank you.
Well, thank you, Mariel, and thanks to all of our presenters. If I could just ask for a round of applause for Zen, Francis, Amanda, Keniel, Tyler, Lisa, and Mariel. Thank you so much.